Kia ora koutou katoa, welcome back. The conversations that have taken place here in the Aotearoa Centre have addressed some of the biggest challenges and opportunities for the APEC region in the current climate. And while the APEC CEO Summit might have wrapped for 2021, the conversation isn't over. I'm Tim McCready, and I'm here to ask this next panel, what have we learnt, and break down some of the key highlights and insights from the more than 50 economic leaders, keynote speakers and panellists that we have heard from. Joining me on the panel today are Fran O'Sullivan, a highly respected business and political commentator for the New Zealand Herald and head of business for ONZM. She's a frequent attendee at APEC and a participant in regional dialogues involving New Zealand. We also have Brent Wilton, Director of Tuhana Business and Human Rights Limited. He has represented many companies on labour and human rights issues, most recently with the Coca-Cola Company as the Global Director of Human and Workplace Rights. And Hannah Pattullo, a finance and economics graduate from University of Wellington. She represented New Zealand at APEC Voices of the Future in Papua New Guinea in 2018 and was involved in facilitating this year's program right here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Welcome to you all. To begin, I would love to ask you all for your key insights that we've heard from the business leaders over the last 2 days. Perhaps Brent, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure, Tim. I mean, it's very difficult to pull out just particular themes from what has been a very robust conversation. I think the organisers need to be congratulated very deeply for what they've been able to achieve in bringing those voices to the table. I think one of the key things that's come out from me is the realisation that whilst business has a positive role to play, it can't do it alone. There is a need to ensure that government remains very much at the table to bring about the policy requirements which are necessary to enable business to succeed. I think the need for more voice, and I think that came across through a number of the speakers, including from heads of state, that we need more people in the conversation. I think the other thing that came through, and John Denton from the International Chamber of Commerce raised this, is making the multilateral system fit for purpose for the new purpose. Because as we build back better, we can't build back on the same structures that obviously have not been working for us for a while. So I think there is a key opportunity for this region and the leaders in this region and the business community in this region to really start to drive what that new multilateral structure could look like for the future.
Yeah, that's right. And I want to come back to that point actually soon, but perhaps Fran, would you like to share some of your key insights?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's probably the economic leaders. That's one of the reasons I've been to APEC so many times, and it's to get an insight on where they're coming from, the big visions they have, how they're connecting with each other, what the challenges are. And I think leading into the conversations which will be taking place in New Zealand overnight at the APEC leaders meeting, we do get a sense of the polarity that's occurring between the Western and democracies and also China, but also to me, the big stars were Xi Jinping. He turned up, and that's to be fated. But also, he made a point that he didn't want to see the region riven by ideological disputes, and some would say, well, he's contributed to that. But I think he made a good point about this is no time for a Cold War. And interestingly, while this summit has been occurring, one really positive thing to see was that he and, or more particularly China and also the US have combining on climate change. And that's fantastic because that is one of the big challenges that we've heard about over the last couple of days. Like Brent, the multilateral issue was for me a highlight, and John Denton, who I have seen in many fora, and he, bless his heart, was robust as ever. He basically got to the point and said, the WTO, in so many words, was in crisis. It had a constitutional issue in front of it. He was very direct about the need for collaboration and also for governments to let business into the table, and we've seen that. I mean, this is the era of big state. Governments are back. They're the only ones who could really deal with a crisis. They have, they have the wherewithal and the kitty, but however, the ideas also come from the private sector.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And Hannah, beaming into this beautiful set all the way from Wellington, how are you? And what were your key insights?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on this panel. It's really awesome to be joining you, Fran and Brent. I mean, yeah, it's been a crazy 2 days. I think the big focus on Indigenous communities and the Indigenous economy was a real highlight, and maybe something that hasn't been seen as much in past CEO summits. So I think New Zealand's done a really fantastic job of getting this on the agenda. And again, it comes back to, inclusivity and including more people in the conversation. And another thing, Brent kind of touched on this, is that inherent need for business and governments to collaborate. And, this is where we're going to achieve the most constructive and sustainable solutions, but also collaborating with the community and having them at the heart of that. So, yeah, a lot of key takeaways, but those would be my two top ones.
Thank you. I know that one of the big themes from this year's summit was, of course, state of the world and recovery post-COVID. We had that great interview with PwC's Bob Moritz and, of course, Alan Bollard's panel discussion. Fran, do you think, after what you've heard over the past 2 days, how well placed is the Asia Pacific for that post-COVID recovery?
I think it's well placed, but both men put huge caveats around that. And we saw, I think Alan made the comment that growth in the last quarter had been 10%. And the forecast out of APEC Secretariat for its regional forecast is for 6% in the current year. However, there's caveats around that, and caveats around political will, political leadership to make sure things stay on the road. The issue also around, the return potentially of COVID. And Helen Clark raised the issue of a fourth surge, which is happening in Europe. And obviously Angela Merkel has been facing that in her last few weeks as Chancellor. But, you did get the sense of listening to it, that to the whole summit, that there was an enormous amount of innovative head of steam there that just needs to be broken out and allowed to play. But against that, it's the global governance, it's a whole range of things, moving to what are the kind of questions about how we open up the borders again, all that. And I think there's some big challenges.
Big challenges, and of course that question mark over whether or not we ever will be in a post-COVID era. Hannah, a question for you. You've spent the last few months working with Voices of the Future delegates, leading one of the groups there. How have the themes at the CEO Summit this year aligned with what youth are talking about and interested in?
We covered 4 themes, and they were, the big meaty themes of the digital future, climate change, international cooperation, and inclusivity. So, as you can imagine, they were all covered in the CEO Summit. I think one thing that definitely stuck out to me is, and we use this exact word, was we cannot have a siloed focus. And I know a few people said that in the summit, and we definitely talked a lot about that in the Voices program as well, is that we've got people, we've got planet, we've got the economy. They're all inextricably linked. And, we need to focus on all of them in an equal way to ensure that we can grow and actually find some solutions to these really big problems that we're facing. And another thing that sort of resonated with me is that we can all make statements, and we've made statements in the Youth Declaration, and business leaders and government leaders have made statements, but we actually need substance behind those statements and actions and concrete actions now, not just 20 years into the future. So I think that's something that we'll be thinking about, the youth, and something that government and business leaders should also be thinking about as well.
Great response. One of the other things that we heard through the summit that we should all be thinking about as businesses, of course, ESG, and it was one of the most popular panel discussions, judging by the comments that were coming in on the online platform. That whole concept of ESG being tied into business as a force for good, also human rights, of course. Brent, I know this is an area that you're quite passionate about and you've worked in. How heartening is it to see it becoming such an integral part of the conversation?
I think it's great. And I think for businesses moving forward, the fact that it is now ESG is very important. Not just E, not just G, not just S, but the 3 together. But I think there is still a risk of it being looked at in silos. So you need to make sure that we're looking to integrate ESG as one word, not 3 initials, so that we are able to actually bring about the change, because you have to work across all of the organisation in order to make this real. But it's very heartening. But it's also important that governments and also companies understand what they say now matters. And if they're saying too much and delivering too little, they are going to come into real conflict very quickly with community stakeholders, their own employees and others. So it's important that as you're looking at ESG, that you are measured in how you approach it and don't as we used to say, egg the custard to make it too rich when they can't deliver on the promises they're making.
And that is actually something that was coming through a lot on the platform. People are saying there's a lot of talk going on, about ESG. Every company's, beginning to talk about it. But how much action, and this is a question for the whole panel, how much action are we actually seeing business take, or is it all talk?
I don't think it's all talk. I think companies are still struggling to understand it, including here in New Zealand. I mean, there are so many big issues facing business at the moment. I mean, with respect, I don't think I'd like to be a CEO of a large company or even a small company in the current environment with so many issues to deal with. But I think if we are able to look at some of the structures that are being established now to help business do this, government has a role to help business do this. And I think also if we start to look at some of the other tools like the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which provide frameworks for these things to be realised, to turn the talk into action. Because if it's not actionable, then I'm sorry, it's not worth the consideration.
Fran, what's your readout on this?
Well, I've probably got a contrary view. I think New Zealand is doing quite well in some areas. We've seen, for instance, the Aotearoa Circle. We've seen sustainable finance. They're having a move next year on energy. And these are the CEOs of some fairly large companies who've got together with the finance sector to actually make actionable points. Reserve Bank, quite unlike some of the central banks around the world, also taking a leadership role. Government actually saying it's going to introduce guidelines for how government fund agencies invest their money. So I think there is a big shift that's really well underway here. It might be harder for the smaller end of town to deal with, but I certainly think corporates have got it fair and square.
Hannah, I'd like to ask you, one of the other big things that kept coming up, of course, was digital innovation, one of the big topics of this year's CEO Summit. And what was it that Amber Mack called it? A relentless adaptation that's going on. What does the next generation think about this, and what do they want to see in that digital space into the future?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic, and I felt like the digital theme was almost talked about in every single keynote or panel discussion. I think one thing, and especially we talked about it in the Voices discussion as well, is that whilst we've got all this innovation and this, as you say, relentless adaptation and big tech and that kind of thing, we still have this digital divide or digital equity. And we've seen this exacerbated through COVID-19. Those who were privileged to be online could still continue with their education or move their businesses online. And those that weren't online have become very vulnerable and exposed. So I think until we get to grips with this digital equity, then this digital innovation isn't going to be as meaningful because it's not shared by everyone. And actually a quote that Amber Mack said, not in the CEO Summit, but she said the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. So, a lot of these technologies are here, but they're not evenly distributed. So that's something that is a big focus for us, definitely.
And really important across the APEC economies, of course. I'd like to, of course, we can't talk about the APEC CEO Summit without talking about all of the big leaders that were here speaking. First of all, question for you, Fran. The President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, he spoke. How big a deal is that for New Zealand? How should we feel about him speaking at our summit?
Well, I think we should be pretty pleased that he's done so. He sent a statement, I think, to one or two of those other meetings that have been happening globally. We come to G20, of course, and COP26 have also been bracketing this. But to actually have him, visually there delivering his statement, and also a statement which is really quite important on the eve of the actual APEC leaders meeting, calling for unity, calling for cooperation, the big challenges of our time. Staking out that comment that he did about no time for a Cold War. Now, everyone's thinking about this because you've got two different constructs happening at the moment. You've got the United States pushing the Indo-Pacific, and of course, APEC still very much Asia-Pacific. So, a bit of warning bell around there. And interesting, of course, when United States is aiming to host APEC in 2023. So a bit of geopolitics, but put that to one side. I thought the messaging was very apposite, really, for this. And I think it was very good to be able to have a leader of that weight addressing the summit in the middle of a pandemic virtually.
Absolutely. And I'd love to know from the other panellists, other leaders of APEC economies that you heard from that you found interesting or inspiring. Brent, would you?
Well, I was interested to hear from the president of Peru. He's a new person in the market, so to speak. So it was very interesting to hear what his point of view was in terms of some of these issues, as also a forthcoming host of APEC himself. I also thought hearing from the likes of the Philippines and Indonesia was also very heartening. They're facing some particular challenges themselves, but I think that there is solidarity there amongst the leaders about what needs to be done. The question is going to be, how do we within the APEC community do our best to support everyone, to Hannah's point, so that everyone can benefit in the future, not just those who have access to it.
And how about you, Hannah? What APEC leader did you most enjoy hearing from?
Yeah, well, I guess looking back on it now, and I didn't quite expect it, but I actually thought Scott Morrison said a few quite interesting points around the digital environment and taking a pragmatic approach to, ensuring that it's a safe space. He talked about freedom of speech, but not being able to say what you want without being accountable, which is key. And also from a couple of other leaders, also MSMEs were talked about quite a lot, which is really cool for the younger audience, because I think a lot of us are starting to embark on our sort of entrepreneurial or business time. So it's awesome to hear that leaders are thinking about MSMEs and how to support them and guide them through a COVID or post-COVID world.
Fran, Brent mentioned President Pedro Castillo from Peru. I know that you follow what's going on in Latin America. What did you think of what he said? It's his first APEC summit. He's only been in power for 3 months. What did you make of it?
I was pretty impressed, and he also had a sales job to come, not just on hosting APEC itself, which of course he's made a bid for, in 2024, but also 3 months into the role, he's come at a critical juncture in some of the LATAM economies. They've been led by centre-right politicians for quite a long time, and he's very definitely leftist. He's got a striking visage. He wears his hat or sombrero or whatever it is. But I think what he was doing was quite a stout defence of what he's trying to do. This is an economy which has had the worst, COVID response in the world. I mean, it has had the highest death rate per capita. It is really in deep straits. And so he's got a big challenge in front of him. I felt he was making a bid for investment into his country. He was trying to tone down suspicions also that basically he would embark on a wave of nationalisation, which is what people said when he came to power. But I thought he was impressive. He took the opportunity. He held the camera.
Yeah, I think he was actually one of the stars of the show. I think everyone's sort of talking about him after that, and I'm not sure that everybody knew who he was ahead of his address. Speaking of stars of the show, of course, Angela Merkel, we heard from her today in her conversation with Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. And I really loved what she said about decisions being made at home having a ripple effect on the planet, which is, of course, true for the environment as well as the pandemic. Let's take a quick look at what she said.
Never before have we been able to realize how interconnected we are globally. What is happening here influences what is happening in Africa, in New Zealand, and in the United States of America. And that sense of how small our globe actually is when it looks to the spread of such a virus, I think that should continue to guide us when we tackle issues like biodiversity and climate protection.
Wasn't that a fantastic interview? And I'd like to get reflections from the panel on that discussion, which I think, as well as speaking to the environment and the pandemic, covered data use and leadership in general. Brent, why don't you go first and tell us what your takeouts from that was?
Well, I think the Chancellor Merkel was very clear and very correct in saying no one's going to do this alone. We've either all got to do it or we're all going to fail. And I think in terms of the conversations that need to occur between all of the regions now become more imperative. We're not going to change climate down here in New Zealand on its own. And I think how you build that collaboration globally, and coming back a bit to what John Denton said about the multilateral system supporting that, is going to be key, because if Germany fails, we're going to fail. If America fails, China's going to fail. There are no winners if this goes wrong. But I think one of the other things I took from the conversation with her and our Prime Minister was this issue about how we talk to people. I think we have to be a little bit more respectful in how we engage in conversations. And it's a bit what Hannah was saying about John Morrison and saying, we need to make sure that we are respectful in the interchanges we have. Because if we don't have that respect to start the conversation, there's not going to be a conversation. Everyone will retreat to their own corners and will make no progress whatsoever. And let's be honest, time is against us. We need quick policy outcomes now, done through a very inclusive process which has business and others at the table as they're developed.
Didn't we hear that passionately from David Suzuki as well?
Correct.
Hannah, could I come to you next for your reflections on that conversation between Angela Merkel and Jacinda Ardern?
Yeah, I mean, it was great, and it was so cool seeing two amazing female leaders up there as well. I guess I really took away a lot from when they were talking about leadership, and Merkel talked about, understanding what makes others tick and where their perspective is, and trying to understand that first before kind of trying to negotiate, a deal or something with them. And as Jacinda said, the willingness to hear the perspective of others is the reflection of a true leader, to engage in conversation, open dialogue, and be transparent. So I think those are all key things that I will definitely take away for myself, and I hope others take away as well.
And Fran, you wrote recently about this conversation coming at a momentous time in global affairs. What did you make of the conversation?
Well, I took it and I watched it and I thought, gosh, what a shame she's going. Huge vacuum. She's been there 16 years. She's been the rock of Europe. She's warned in recent commentary about, waves of nationalism, but potential for a Second World War, the lessons having to be learnt. And then again, she didn't frame that up today, but, she was talking quite differently. But it's sort of part of a kind of like a swan song of major addresses she's been making over the last few weeks. And this one took it a bit further in the personal sense. But she is going to be, leave a gap there. And you could see the way she kind of calibrates how she approaches people and how she's managed to just be at that apex for so long. So I think any leader wanting to have longevity in an area, where you've got to bring a lot of nation states together should be looking at her.
Yeah, and I think that was demonstrated when she said she was there at COP1.
Yeah, exactly.
We're now at COP26. I guess speaking of climate, Hannah, I'd like to put a question to you about that conversation with Jerome Foster. I really enjoyed speaking with him, and he spoke about how important it is for leaders to listen to younger voices. Do you think that their voices are being heard, and is business listening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Jerome, such a inspiration. And yeah, I think they are, and more so. I mean, a good example of it is New Zealand has set the tone in our Voices program. Our youth declaration was handed to the chair of APEC, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and this is the first time that it has been handed to the chair. And I really hope that this continues to happen at subsequent programs. So it's cool that New Zealand can be on the forefront of that and really set the tone. And actually, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said that you'd be surprised by how many times a youth voice has influenced her decision-making. So I hope that we can lead the way with that. And I think Jerome also said, the youth voice is important. If we're resilient and we show up, we will be listened eventually. And he is such a good example of that. He did how many climate strikes, and then, he's the youngest advisor to the Biden administration. So there's a long way to go, but we're definitely getting there.
And just sort of on that thread, I'd like to just ask the whole panel what you all think in terms of our efforts to tackle climate change as a region. We've heard this urgency at COP26. We've spoken about it here at the APEC CEO Summit, and we've heard about technologies like hydrogen that'll be, potentially coming on board, electric vehicles. Robin Denholm from Tesla gave that great keynote speech. How are we going with that?
Well, I think we've got a heck of a long way to go, and it is obviously one of the issues in front of the leaders tonight when they speak. Climate change is here and now. It's a major issue. Effectively, we've failed so far as a region to make huge headway on this. There have been big statements of purpose now from out of the United States and China, which is essential. But also what's essential is, kind of letting the innovative spirit come free, a big focus on green innovation from economies and businesses, and also the kind of things which governments can do, which moving away from fossil fuel subsidies, which is something APEC is tackling. But there's a long way to go, and listening to David Suzuki, you did get the sense it was a giant fail so far.
Something he's been campaigning on his whole lifetime, right? Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of where we are, I agree with Fran, we've got a long way to go. And I think there's a huge role for education in this. It was talked about the role of government and the government having the responsibility as a legitimate representative of the people, to do the various balancing acts that have to occur in terms of policy. But government has to set expectations with their populations. We cannot expect to continue to live the lives we've led till now if we're going to get anywhere close to 1.5 as the goal. That means people are going to have to be told, because they won't do it willingly, that certain ways of living are no longer going to be acceptable. That's tough for any politician to deal with. And I think the more cohesion we can have as a region around tackling some of those issues, the better. Because it's always a situation, you move first, then I'll move. And if you haven't moved first, I'm not moving. And so how do you actually get beyond that inertia occasioned by someone not wanting to be first? So how do we move it together?
And Hannah, what would you say about that? What is the younger generation thinking about, or the younger generation that you've been working with at the Voices of the Future in particular? What do they think about the future prospect for the climate at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, kind of echo what Fran and Brent have said. I think, again, there are a lot of statements or promises that are quite far in advance. That means maybe we're not taking the immediate actions required to actually hit those goals and targets. And I think Robin from Tesla was saying that as well. So, I think it's about concrete actions, immediate actions, and not just thinking about 2050, because we actually need to think about now. And we talked a lot about education as well, climate justice, fossil fuel subsidies, all things really front of mind in the youth side of things. So, yeah.
Fran, I'd like to turn to you now. We were talking just prior to this panel, and I believe this is your 15th CEO Summit. You were also on the CEO Summit board in 1999 when it was last hosted here in New Zealand. Could you tell us a little bit about what's changed and how you found this summit compared to that one all the way back in 1999?
Well, I guess obviously we're holding it virtually, but however, I mean, it was different back then because China was out in the world pretty much for the first time. It was pre the WTO. So the China delegation was only about 13 people coming down to New Zealand, bigger delegations elsewhere from the region. It was off the back of the Asian financial crisis. So again, at a time of crisis, again, New Zealand's role to bring some unity, to take it forward, because the year prior in Kuala Lumpur had been a wipeout. There were sort of major issues there. So I think New Zealand performed a hugely good role there. It was intimate. There were characters who came to town. And, obviously people like Bill Clinton and so forth, and Jiang Zemin, the then, president of China, who even played the piano at one evening function. So it had intimacy, it had a kind of relatability. But so does this, and in a different way, because it is being done virtually. You are seeing people close up, you're engaged. If you're going to a normal APEC CEO Summit meeting, generally people will come in for sessions that interest them. Then they'll go off and network or go with their government delegations and do lobbying and do deals and all of that. This is quite different. It gives you a very intimate insight into what's happening, and also, has brought younger people and all sorts of other issues into. And I think it's also been great branding for New Zealand. There's been wonderful vignettes. It's presented the New Zealand story and the New Zealand brand in a very captivating and engaging way. So there's big differences, but also wonderful similarities of just what that New Zealand spirit is.
And I'd love to ask the other two on the panel how you found the summit, and in particular that what Fran was saying there. Normally when we host the APEC CEO Summit, we're expecting tens of thousands of people to come to town. We get to show off Aotearoa New Zealand. Of course, it's a little bit different this time, but I know there was a lot of effort made to really portray New Zealand to the world. How do you think that went across, Brent?
Well, I think it went very, very well. And to Fran's point, I think instead of people wandering around the halls, there was a more focused discussion around some of these key themes that I think you wouldn't necessarily have in an in-person meeting. I think the challenge going forward is when we get back into in-person meetings, how do we maintain the benefits of the virtual as much as anything? I think also that what I've seen here needs to be on New Zealand television. I mean, people need to see this. The vignettes that Fran just talked about, fascinating. Things I had not seen or was aware of, that more people need to understand as part of this education that we need to take forward. But I think New Zealand has shown that it is able to be an inclusive partner in this space, a trusted partner in this space. And I think moving forward, even though APEC may move to another state in terms of a host, there is a real key role for New Zealand to continue to build on what's been built here.
Get this on TV. We'll have a word with the executive director of the summit about that.
I'd watch it again.
Hannah, how about you? How did it go for you? How do you think New Zealand was portrayed, and what was that online experience like with what I think was the most ever Voices of the Future delegates to attend a CEO Summit?
Yeah, for sure. I was going to touch on that. I mean, I actually have to laugh because never would I have thought that I would be attending a premier conference in my university flat in my bedroom, and it's honestly crazy. And yeah, because it's been online, we've been able to have all 21 economies involved, and also a wider New Zealand delegation join us for the summit. So it's arguably been the most inclusive and accessible for the wider region, which has been really cool. And to the New Zealand image, I mean, I love New Zealand. And the Chia sisters, Sir Ian Taylor with animation research, we're a small nation, but we stack up pretty well and we do some pretty cool things down here. I loved Stephen Colbert's attempt at speaking Kiwi. It was pretty funny, and it just shows our unique New Zealand culture, our community, and that we don't always take ourselves too seriously. So, and also some really key messages from our premier sponsors as well. So I think, APEC's just done an incredible job of putting New Zealand on the global stage.
And we have just about 5 minutes left. So I might just do a sweep right across the panel and ask you all, what do you think the biggest change that business should be making? What would you suggest to business that they should really be thinking about from everything that we've heard at this year's APEC CEO Summit? Hannah, I'll come back to you first.
I'm going to have to go with the ESG, and it's just so important. I think, especially the young generation, Gen Z. As Jonathan Haidt said, we are true liberals, apparently, and we are demanding for social change. We're demanding for that social agenda. We want businesses to look past the bottom line, past profits, and put people and planet first. So if anything, I think that is the biggest thing for businesses to take away from this, for sure.
How about you, Brent? What's your one message to business?
Well, Hannah just took my ESG
yeah, I was going to say that
for that. I think we're all just about mute. No, not at all. I think one of the things that came through from me was the need for companies to be listening more, perhaps speaking less, but listening more. How do you bring those different voices into a business in a meaningful way? Business spends a lot of time talking to itself, and I think there is a real benefit, and Hannah mentioned it, around the youth voice, the Indigenous voice, the voice of labour, the workforce. There's a lot that business needs to be thinking about how do you build that inclusivity that you need in order for the ESG to gel within the business and to have the support of the communities for that business to continue to grow in a way which is responsible to its people.
And on that note, wasn't it fantastic to have that Indigenous voice and that final panel as well, talking about Indigenous inclusion? I think this is the first CEO Summit where that's been sort of on the table as an important topic. Fran, I'll come to you and let you have the last word.
In terms of business?
What would you tell business after watching the last 2 days?
Well, I'll echo the comments of my fellow panellists, but I'd also say, to get out of your nation boundaries, at least virtually, look at what's happening in the world, look at the trends. I learnt so much over the last, couple of days. There's a lot happening there. All the issues around addressing, rising costs, supply chains, all of that, they're still very, very necessary. And it's very, very necessary to get some global rules of the game. And I think business needs to be pushing its nation-state leaders or economy leaders to get on and do that. It's really essential.
And I think that's a really fantastic place to leave it. I just want to thank all three panellists for joining. Hannah, for coming in from your bedroom there in Wellington.
Very tidy bedroom too.
Very tidy bedroom. And coming up next, we have a panel discussion that will be moderated by Zaina Jalil, and she's going to ask, what does this all mean? What's next for New Zealand? But thanks for joining, and thank you all very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.